Today, Latin America was once many native nations. Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Dutch, and Danish all invaded. They carried out genocide after genocide and enslaved both natives and Africans. After independence, most new governments were still white-dominated, with more genocides against natives in nations like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. European powers hold on to some territories even today, and kept invading to take their colonies back. The United States invaded too, overthrowing or trying to overthrow over 60 governments, the last attempt in the year 2020 in Venezuela. The U.S. also took half of Mexico's land and a tenth of its people, and then Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. There's a long history of many Americans fearing and hating Latinos. Latin American image and reality is often one of instability, poverty, drug cartels, revolutions, corruption, and refugees. But it did not have to be this way. Latin America could remain all or mostly native nations. I spoke about this in detail in the previous series, What If Natives Won? Poverty, white domination, and foreign invasions could have been stopped, prevented, or limited. The U.S. could have been more Latino culturally, with higher numbers of Latinos. The U.S. could have been less racist, less dominating, or the U.S. could be defeated. Some Latin American nations could even become regional or world powers. There's a huge lack of alternate history about Latin America and Latinos. So much alternate history is Europe-centered, mostly because so much history teaching is Europe-centered. This series is dedicated to scenarios, points of departure, and possibilities of Latin American victory within Latin America, and a more Latino or less racist American society. My name is Carroll. I'm Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College. I've written mostly about wars, veterans, human rights, and genocide. My next history book will be Genocide Denial in America, about the 7 genocides against indigenous people that took place in the U.S. that most people were never taught about, don't know, or deny. I've also written some science fiction, mostly alternate history. One story, Timely Saviors, appeared in a short story collection, The Witness Paradox. I'm also, together with Rob Schmidt of Bluecorn Comics, editing and putting out a short story alternate history collection, What If Natives Won? Or Killing Columbus. I've also written a sci-fi alternate history book, The Man in Black, the first of a series. For 40 years, the Cold War dominated the world and everything in it. In spite of its name, it had a high death toll, from 6 to 7 million, and dozens of revolts, civil wars, overthrows, and major wars, the best known in the U.S. being the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Of course, the Cold War didn't have to happen. The only disagreement is over who caused it and how to prevent it. For those who blame only the Soviets, the way to prevent it is to prevent Russia from going communist. For those who blame the U.S., or for those who blame mutual misunderstanding, prevent the U.S. from starting the Cold War. Plenty of historians argue Truman is the man more than anyone else who caused the Cold War. A different president wouldn't have started these wars. Another way to stop the Cold War is if the U.S. accepted Stalin's offer for a neutral Germany. No Berlin crises, no blockade or airlift, thus far less tension and less or no arms race. Or if Stalin dies sooner from his many health problems. A reform-minded premier rules the next, and they will end the forced labor camps and most confrontations far sooner. The Cold War perhaps ends by the mid-50s. So how would this affect Latin America? Nation by nation, almost every one of them was affected, especially by U.S. invasions and overthrows. War after war, civil wars, coups, invasions, dictatorships in the name of fighting communism, even genocide. Communism did kill about 8,000 people in one nation, Cuba, and tens of thousands in another, the Shining Path terrorist in Peru. But everywhere else, the death toll was far higher from anti-communism, killing many more than that in almost every nation in Latin America. Start with the most obvious, Cuba. With no Cold War, will Castro ever come to power? Quite possibly he still would. The small Communist Party in Cuba actually worked with Batista to control Cuba's labor unions. Most of Castro's rebels were not communist. The Cuban Revolution was far more nationalist, against American control. The biggest difference without a Cold War is no Cuban Missile Crisis, which means the U.S. may invade, or the U.S. may just ignore what's going on in Cuba as unimportant. Almost next door is the Dominican Republic. In the name of fighting communism, the U.S. supported dictator Rafael Trujillo for over 30 years. Trujillo may fall from power sooner, with fewer deaths, less exploitation, corruption, and theft from Dominican people. Lyndon Johnson, if he still becomes the U.S. president, is also less likely to invade in the mid-60s, on the very thin and completely false claim that President Juan Bosch was communist. Little Grenada also would be very different. Reagan ordered an invasion to overthrow the New Jewel movement. Grenada was the only nation where the Black Power movement ruled the nation. The U.S. invasion killed almost 120 people, including 24 when a mental hospital was accidentally bombed. In Jamaica, there was a gang war between the two main political parties that killed almost 1,000. The most famous victim was Bob Marley, who survived an assassination attempt, shot twice, and his wife was also shot. The Labour Party hired the drug gang, the Shower Posse, and they were armed by the CIA. The Labour Party falsely accused the People's National Party of being communist, though they were democratic socialist. No region would be more affected than Central America. In Costa Rica, there was a failed communist revolt in 1948. But this uprising likely still happens. It was locally planned, and it had no aid from Soviets or anyone else. The U.S. did consider sending in troops, but didn't have to. One of the ironies is Costa Rica abolished its army, partly because it had many communist troops in it. In Nicaragua, there would still be a revolution in the 1970s, a locally led coalition that only had some communists, less than 10% of all of them. What would change is there would be no American-created terrorists, the so-called Contras, and thus no Nicaraguan civil war in the 1980s. This means a death toll of over 50,000 avoided, and a nation recovering from dictatorship, and much faster. In El Salvador, a civil war in the 1980s likely still happens, but it won't be as long or as brutal. The rebels were local and mostly indigenous. They did have minor help from Nicaragua and Cuba. They would still rise up against the military dictatorship. Without U.S. help, those dictators and the 14 families, all of them white, who ruled over the Indian and Mestizo majority, they wouldn't last more than a few years. Guatemala would see the biggest change of all. No genocide, no long civil war, not even the overthrow of Arbenz in 1954. Nowhere did the U.S. do more damage in the Cold War than in Guatemala. A Democratic president was kicked out by false accusations of communism by a CIA director, Dulles, who had huge investments there. A civil war for 30 years, and finally over 600 native villages destroyed, its people slaughtered, killing up to 200,000 Mayas. Without the Cold War, none of this happens. Guatemala would be far more native, less viciously racist, and more democratic. In Cuba, the long uprising by FARC, a Marxist guerrilla force, possibly still happens. The Colombian government relied on U.S. weapons, training, and even chemical warfare against FARC. At times, FARC held up to 40% of Colombia's territory. Colombian far-right militias, though, have done a lot more killing than FARC, at least 4 times as much. Without U.S. military aid, they might be less successful, but drug war hysteria still might be an excuse for the U.S. government to send military aid anyway. Peru's shining path, the most brutal communist terrorist in Latin America, likely still arise. They were local, with no support from outside, and really not that much support even from communists within Peru, including the Communist Party in Peru. This was a brutal civil war lasting 20 years, but neither the Soviets nor the U.S. played any major role. There were over 70,000 deaths, and this is still likely to happen even without the Cold War. After Guatemala, Chile is the nation that would change the most, and for the best, with no Cold War. Salvador Allende, an elected socialist, is never overthrown by the CIA, IT&T, and General Pinochet. The U.S. government doesn't care anymore about a socialist in Chile any more than it cares about who runs Mongolia. One of the oldest democracies in Latin America is never overthrown, Over 3,000 people are never killed, and thousands more tortured and imprisoned. And the great folk singer Victor Jara lives. Finally, Brazil has less chance of a military dictatorship without the Cold War. It is not certain. Brazil's military dictators go back to the 1930s, and fear of communism was the excuse then as well. But it will have far less U.S. aid, and will not last as long, meaning fewer dead, especially hundreds of thousands of Amazon Indians. Altogether, hundreds of thousands of Latin Americans survive, and almost all the nations are far better off. This is the end of the video. Please repost freely, like, and repost. This has been Latin American Victory. Next time we will discuss what if Cuba without Fidel.